The timing of this matched up surprisingly well. Guess it's pretty inevitable that I have to talk about this, huh? Then again, this does count as a Muppet project, which means... Yes, the Muppet Vlog is back, and this time around we will be discussing about something a little bit different, something that is actually pretty rare that I would discuss in this series, and that is a documentary. Specifically, the Disney Plus documentary, Jim Henson, Idea Man. And just like what my puppet alter ego said right at the beginning, yes, the timing of this feels like it fits a little too perfectly well in my case, or the coincidence just fits a little too perfectly. And that is because not too long before making this video, I actually finished my own Jim Henson-like documentary, Animation Lookback, The Muppets. I finished all of the parts, and I even put up the completed version that is over 5.5 hours long. And if you haven't checked that one out, I highly recommend you do so. I had a great time making that one. It took a few years to go through all the parts, but honestly, it was worth it, and I'm very proud with what I have done. But we're not here to go and discuss about my documentary. We are here to go and discuss about the Disney Plus documentary. And to go and give you a quick summary about it, in case you're not familiar with it, Jim Henson Idea Man is the Disney Plus exclusive documentary that is made by acclaimed filmmaker Ron Howard, in which he would go and have a discussion with many of the people that personally knew Jim Henson, ranging from friends and family and people who had experience working with Jim, and they would go and chronicle Jim Henson's life from his very early beginnings, from his childhood all the way down to his unfortunate passing, and looking upon the massive impact that he has made upon entertainment in general, thanks to many of his beloved works such as Sesame Street, The Muppet Show, The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, and several others. And not only was I hyped up for this documentary because I am a major Jim Henson fan and I am a lifelong fan of The Muppets, but also there is something that hasn't been talked about enough in regards to Disney Plus. And I just want to say what you will about the streaming platform, regardless about the works that they would have in their library or about the business and how it is affecting the Walt Disney Company. But I personally feel like Disney Plus has some very underrated documentaries. In fact, I would even go as far and say that some of the documentaries that they have, they are some of the most underrated works that you will find on Disney Plus, and a lot of them have been absolutely brilliant, regardless if they are movies or shows. And these include the Imagineering story, Don Hahn's Howard Ashman documentary called Howard. There is the Mickey Mouse one called The Story of a Mouse. There is Into the Unknown, the making of Frozen 2, and several others. But the point that I want to go and make is that when Disney Plus would go and bring out a documentary, regardless if it's something from their legacy or if they are the behind the scenes of how some of their films are made, like Frozen 2, Elemental, or the Spark shorts, or even some of the stuff that's related to musicians. Like, Disney has been on a massive binge on that, especially after the Beatles one, Get Back. So the point that I want to go and make is that not only am I a big fan of Jim Henson and the Muppets, but I am also a fan of Disney Plus's documentaries. And when you combine that all together with this Jim Henson documentary on Disney Plus, then I am honestly hyped up. That's when I know that I'm going to be ready for something truly exciting. And especially after just going through my own documentary about Jim Henson and the Muppets, I would like to see a new take on it that, well, of course, is going to be a lot more professional, and that it will have firsthand accounts from the people that knew Jim Henson. So to go and actually get into this documentary, there is one question that I want to go and immediately answer. And that is in regards to the fact that, well, this is far from the first time that Jim Henson's life story has been told. We have seen several different versions of his biography, rather it be the book by Brian J. Jones, or there is the Defunctland miniseries by Kevin Perjurer, or, well, there's also my documentary with Animation Lookback, The Muppets. So some may wonder, what is the big difference between all of those previous adaptations of Jim Henson's life compared to this one that we have right now? Is there a significant difference that makes that one stand out compared to all the others? And honestly, I would say yes, absolutely. And it's actually in relation to something that I have already brought up, and that is the fact that we have gotten firsthand accounts of who Jim Henson is from the people that personally knew him, ranging from his family members, most namely his children, Brian, Cheryl, Heather, and Lisa. And then you also got his friends whom they have collaborated with Jim for decades, such as Frank Oz, Dave Goelz, and Fran Brill, and even people who have previously worked with Jim Henson, like they brought in Rita Moreno talking about her experience of working as a guest star in one of the first episodes of The Muppet Show.
You can see my nostrils flare at the end, which is me trying desperately not to laugh.
And when you listen to their story about their times with Jim Henson, you do get that sense of heart that comes out of it, where it is a personal story and that you hear about how Jim Henson has affected their life, not just in terms of their business, not just as a family member, but also as someone who has left a significant impact, someone whom their lives have completely changed thanks to Jim Henson. And you get to hear about the kind of person that he is. And let me tell you, there is actually a pretty big difference between listening to either me or Kevin Perjurer discussing about Jim Henson, or even just reading about it on the Brian J. Jones book, and that you actually hear it firsthand from, or well, technically secondhand, because it's not like you're actually there with either Brian Henson or Frank Oz to listen to those stories. But I mean that you get to listen to them discussing about their times with Jim Henson, and just the genuine reminiscence that they had from those days, that rather if they could be happy or sad or anything like that, you could tell that they look back at it, and they look back at it fondly, that, you know, it was an enjoyable memory that they would like to go and share with Jim Henson. And you kind of get that unique perspective and a bit of a clearer idea of who Jim Henson is. And that's where you get that extra element of heart, where now you do see more of Jim Henson as a person, because we're all familiar of Jim Henson as a puppeteer, as an entertainer, and even a bit of a businessman. But as Jim Henson, the individual, the person who can be either a father or a friend, now you do get a bit of a clear picture of who he is because of those firsthand accounts that are being told by those people. And that is something that does make it stand out, and that is what makes the storytelling here more impactful.
I said, I've never directed before. Why ask me? And this is typical Jim. He said, because it would be better.
But then there is another element that actually does make it stand out from the other biography adaptations, and that is in terms of the presentation, where this is a very artistic version of Jim Henson's life, or at least an artistic biography that really does play a lot in terms of the editing, and even a lot of animation, rather it be with playing around with sketches that Jim Henson has done in the past, or even a lot of stop motion. And I do get the direction that they are going with this. I can understand if some people might complain about it and think that it might be a little bit too distracting and that they're emphasizing a little too hard about like it's a style kind of thing. Like, I understand if some people might be a bit annoyed, or they would find many of these artistic scenes a bit distracting. But for me, I actually do get the direction that they are going, and I personally find it to be pretty enjoyable, because what they try to do in this documentary is that they want to be a bit reminiscent to how Jim Henson was as an experimental filmmaker, especially back in the early 1960s, or before the days of Sesame Street, especially looking back into his non-puppeteering works, especially the Oscar-nominated short called Timepiece that Jim Henson did. In fact, there is a lot of throwbacks and references that you would see of Timepiece throughout the documentary. And that is actually one thing that I would say is a similarity to the Defunctland miniseries, is the way that it would use Timepiece as a way to go and present elements in Jim Henson's life. And sometimes like they would use it as segues to go from one part of Jim's life to the next, or show like the time that Jim Henson doesn't really have, whether it be that he's really busy or that the amount of time that he has in his life is not really that much. And it's a little bit similar to what Kevin Perjurer would do. It's just that in the documentary with Jim Henson Idea Man, it shows that it has a far bigger budget to go and really experiment around with footage of Timepiece and use it in a way with their own little pieces of animation. And speaking of that stop motion animation, because, well, I do kind of have to talk about it because I am also an animation critic, so I kind of have to talk about that bit. The animation used here is actually really cool. Again, it does emulate the style of what Jim Henson did back in the 1960s very well, but also it is very creative with the way that it would not only use objects, but also with people. Like, there was one little moment that they even took Frank Oz, and in order to go and introduce him, they actually played with a bit of stop motion with the guy himself. And on top of that, they would even use stop motion to show the creation of Kermit the Frog.
It was my mother's coat and a ping pong ball, which I cut in half to make the eyes.
And I know that technically it's not necessarily like the biggest aspect of this documentary. It's not necessarily a significant factor compared to many of the other things they would go and talk about. But I do find it to be a very nice addition and a great symbolism to go and show Jim Henson's creativity. To show the world of Jim Henson that, yes, even some bits of animation has been involved in there, and how it did play a role in Jim Henson's life, and that it is part of some of his work. So with the animation there, the quality of it is actually very nice, and the people who have worked on it, they have done a solid job. But then there is one more element in this documentary that I feel like it stands out compared to the other Jim Henson documentaries, and that is the fact that it has never before seen footage. Of course, that is one thing that it has often promoted in order to get some Muppet fans and Jim Henson fans to get on board with this, is that you would get to see some never before seen footage about Jim Henson's life. And not only do you get to see some never before seen home movies of Jim Henson spending time with his family, but you also get to see some footage of Jim Henson during his childhood. But not only that, but there are also some things that they show that was previously never seen before, but these are like some monumental moments in Muppet history. Like, one great example is that you actually get to see the making of the world famous Rainbow Connection scene from the Muppet movie. It has often been talked about how Jim Henson would actually pull off that innovative scene of Kermit the Frog singing Rainbow Connection with his banjo in the swamp, but you actually do see it in action. Like, you actually do see Jim Henson going in and going out of that little submarine where he would just be crammed in while controlling Kermit the Frog. And not only that, but you even get some extra facts that you never knew about either Jim Henson or the Muppets. I can guarantee you that you will actually learn something in this documentary that you never had before. Rather, if you are not that familiar with the Muppets, or even if you've been a massive avid Muppet fan like myself, there is at least one thing that you will learn in this that is completely new. Like, one great example is the initial creation of Kermit the Frog. Like, his first purpose, like originally when Jim Henson first created Kermit, it wasn't actually for the sake of Sam and Friends. It was actually to entertain his dying grandfather. Like, even before Kermit would go and entertain people in Washington, D.C. with Sam and Friends, he would just be entertaining Jim Henson's dying grandfather. And I find that to actually be a pretty sweet moment there. So yeah, honestly, this is one thing that for Muppet fans especially, you will either see something new or that you will learn something new from Jim Henson. So there is actually a vast amount of knowledge in relation to both Jim Henson and the Muppets that was never known to the public before. And for the first time, you actually get to learn that with Jim Henson Idea Man. So from there, that's where it gets those extra points of value to why Muppet fans should go and check this one out. However, there is a criticism that I have to give to this documentary. Now, it's not something that completely ruins it per se, but I do find that it is a flaw that takes it away from being something that really is amazing or something that would be considered one of the best documentaries that you would find on Disney+. Now, I'm just going to go and state this right now. I understand that as it is a documentary movie, you cannot go and literally put in everything about Jim Henson onto this film. Like, there are some aspects in his life that you have to take away so that you would go and just focus on his story, and you would have to go and tell it on a certain amount of time. Now, that factor, I completely understand. But there are some decisions on what to take away from Jim Henson's story that it makes it feel like the way they would portray Jim Henson is a little too perfect. That it has this hesitancy to show any of his flaws or any of his downsides, to show that not everything about Jim Henson is perfect and massively successful. I mean, technically, yes, there are a few instances where they would show some of the downsides to Jim's life, or even some of the things that really did not work out in terms of Jim Henson's projects. Even though there is one exception where that is a significant portion where they would go and actually talk about, most of them, or if not almost all of them, they would just like quickly glance over. Like, they would go and mention it, but then they would quickly move on to the other thing that has been massively successful for Jim Henson and the Muppets. So that would be my big criticism. It's just, I feel like it purposely tries to present him something more than just a human being. Because let's be fair, everybody has flaws, and even Jim Henson has flaws. And the way that they would go and present Jim Henson, it just feels like a little bit manipulative, showing him that he is too good, if you do get what I mean. And I know I was a little bit vague with my statement there, but I actually do have some examples of what I am talking about. And before I continue on that, I just want to give you all a bit of a warning that I will be getting into some spoilers. Now, if you are not familiar with Jim Henson's life, or you don't want to be spoiled with what's been talked about in Jim Henson Idea Man, then all you have to do is just skip to here, and then you'll be okay. But I just want to go and mention this right now, just so nobody would be upset if I would go and directly spoil anything major. But anyways, I just want to state now, like I said before, I know that they cannot go and look into literally everything that Jim Henson has done in his life. And I'll even say now, there are plenty of notable projects that Jim Henson has done that this documentary has not necessarily looked into. Like, there's a lot of the TV specials that they didn't really talk much about, such as The Frog Prince or Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas. There are even some of his movies that they didn't really talk about. Like, yeah, they talked about the Muppet movie, The Dark Crystal, and Labyrinth, but they didn't talk at all about either The Great Muppet Caper or Muppets Take Manhattan. In fact, speaking of that one, they didn't even talk about Muppet Babies at all. They didn't even acknowledge its existence, or barely even acknowledged it. And on top of that, they also did not talk about Muppet Vision 3D. Like, they did show some of the behind the scenes when Jim Henson was making Muppet Vision 3D, including some clips that did feature Steve Whitmire, surprisingly enough. But they didn't actually brought up Muppet Vision 3D or even mention any of his plans that he wanted to do based on theme parks. But again, I'm not going to go and consider that a massive criticism. I know some fans might be a little bit disappointed that maybe some of their famous Jim Henson works might not be brought up in this documentary, but I personally get it because the main focus is to discuss about the life of Jim Henson, and there are those minor aspects that they don't necessarily have to really get into or to really go and talk about. So in that regards, okay, fine. Like, I can imagine some people might get upset, but I don't think it is an element that really is worth criticizing or that I would consider to be a flaw in the documentary. But going back to my actual criticism in terms of the way that they would show Jim Henson being too perfect, one great example of that is actually how they presented Jim Henson's love life. And in that regard, the main thing that they would just talk about with that is just his relationship with Jane Henson. Now, I will say that the biggest criticism about Jim Henson as a person is that he's not really that good of a lover, or he's not really good at maintaining relationships or even at being a boyfriend or a husband. And they do look into that just a tiny bit, but the way that they would try to go and frame this is in a way where they don't want to make it antagonistic to Jim Henson, or in a way that his work ethic, or especially with his extremely busy schedule with stuff like Sesame Street, The Muppets, and his many other projects, like, they don't want to frame that as a bad thing in terms of his relationship with Jane Henson, or even with his role as a father. Like, it tries very much to be careful with that. And even at the point when Jim Henson and Jane actually did legitimately get that divorce, like, they tried to go and present that in a way where it's like nobody is the bad guy in this, and they still try to present Jim Henson as someone who is good, or even that this moment is not even Jim Henson's fault, that it's just, that, oh, well, the divorce is just part of life, I guess. I mean, it's just part of the course for Jim Henson's genius creativity and stuff like that.
That there was an innocence getting lost and that it was going to impact his relationship with us and everything, and that was complex.
In fact, I'll even go as far and say that they did not once ever mention about Marianne Cleary, who was Jim Henson's lover after Jane. And from there, okay, I do get maybe some parts, like, they're not worth mentioning as much, but that is an example in terms of the way that they try a little too hard to present Jim Henson as more than a human being that can have their own set of flaws. But then there was one moment that I must say has to be the most suspicious moment of the entire documentary. The one where I had to go and take a step back and just say, hold on a minute, something ain't right with what you are doing. And that is at the end of Jim Henson's life. Because no joke, the way they would try to go and chronicle that is that they would go and discuss about the failure of Labyrinth, and then it would fast forward to say that a bunch of stuff has happened in Jim Henson's life where he was fascinated with technology and trying to find innovative ways for puppetry, even highlighting Waldo as the first computer-generated Muppet. And then they would go straight to Jim Henson passing away. Like, yeah, maybe they will go and just quickly bring up stuff like the Jim Henson Hour, the Storyteller, Fraggle Rock, and even the Disney deal, but it did not have any time to go and discuss about those and just go straight to Jim Henson's death. And that's the part where I just feel extremely iffy, and it's not necessarily something that I question Ron Howard's creative decision in terms of making this documentary, but it really did highlight that this is, after all, a Disney Plus documentary, that this is, after all, Disney who is making this documentary. And isn't it rather curious that Disney decided to just glance over the final year of Jim Henson's life, that they didn't really talk much about what happened during that Disney deal? And I don't necessarily mean about those plans that Jim Henson wanted to do at Disney MGM Studios, now called Disney Hollywood Studios. You know, it's not just that. It's not just that they wouldn't talk about Muppet Vision 3D, but it's some of the problems that occurred with the Disney deal and how that affected his final parts of his life. I don't know. Isn't it a little bit suspicious that Disney would decide to go and just skip that part entirely? Gee, I wonder why Disney doesn't want to go and talk about that agreement that is famously called by Jim Henson that goddamn deal. But to the documentary's credit, though, I will give it that the ending is actually very tender, and it is, of course, very bittersweet. Like, it knows how to pull on your heartstrings. It knows how to capture that emotional moment, and how it is a bit heartbreaking when Jim Henson passed away and how that affected many of his friends and family members at that time. So it did manage to stick the landing well. And I'm not saying that it makes it forgivable for what it did just before, but it did have a very nice ending. And not to mention that you do get a montage of just a quick recap of the things that has happened afterwards, with how the Muppets is still going strong to this day, with how the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth are now considered classics. And you even see a bit of a montage of not just like what happened with the Muppets ever since, but even some of the works of Jim Henson, or at least with the Jim Henson Creature Shop. And surprisingly, there was actually one moment where you do get to see Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio get highlighted. It's kind of shocking, but it is a testament to how amazing Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is, that even another streaming platform like Disney Plus would go and highlight that it is a great movie and a great moment that carries the legacy of Jim Henson. And I mean, I love Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. It is so far one of my favorite movies of the 2020 decade. And honestly, I just love it that even Disney Plus is sending in some love for that movie. So when it comes to Jim Henson Idea Man, I think this is a very well done documentary. I think Ron Howard and his team did an awesome job at this. And as a Jim Henson fan myself, I am very satisfied with what they have done, especially when they managed to hit all the right notes in order to make this a very engaging documentary, not only making it informative, but also making it emotional as well, where you learn about why is it that Jim Henson's works have been so beloved and so successful even to this day, but at the same time, you get to learn a lot about who Jim Henson is as a person, which was told by both his family members and his friends. Now, I won't say that this is a perfect documentary, especially with the way that it is a little too hesitant to go and portray any flaws or any of the downsides of Jim Henson's life. Or even say that Jim Henson had some problems in his past, or that not all of his works were massively successful and he had some failures before. But still, though, whenever it did something right, it managed to do so greatly, especially to go and discuss about many of our favorite Muppet projects and even some of our favorite Muppets as well. And I just want to go and say that if you are a fan of Jim Henson, of the Muppets, or Sesame Street, or any of his works, then yes, I do think this is a must-watch, that this is absolutely worth checking out. And like I said before, this is the kind of documentary that you will be coming out with learning something new in regards to Jim Henson, or seeing something new from Jim Henson's life, whether it be in his family life, or even from the behind the scenes when making many of his beloved projects. So it'll definitely be worthwhile for you. And even for non-fans, this is absolutely worth checking out. In fact, if you want to learn about Jim Henson and you don't really have a whole lot of knowledge, this is actually a very good start. I mean, yeah, sure, you got all the other Jim Henson biographies out there, including the Brian J. Jones book, the Defunctland miniseries, and my Animation Lookback of the Muppets. But this one is actually a good first step, where you do get a very strong summary about the life of Jim Henson. So for everyone, this is definitely a documentary that is worth checking out. And as for my rating, honestly, I have contemplated either to go and give it a 7 or an 8 out of 10. I was like juggling between the two, but I decided ultimately I'm gonna go right into the middle, and I'm gonna give this a 7.5 out of 10, or 3 out of 4 stars, if you will. Again, this is not necessarily the best documentary that Disney Plus has put out. Like, it does have its obvious flaws, and you don't get to learn about literally everything that has happened in Jim Henson's life. But this is still a great documentary nonetheless, and it is still worth watching. So for Disney Plus and for Ron Howard and his team, this is definitely a great addition to their collection. And with that said, that should do it for this little review of Jim Henson Idea Man and for this episode of the Muppet Vlog. So I just want to go and say thank you all so much for watching. And by the way, if you had a great time watching this, then don't forget to go and hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, where I have plenty of other Muppet related content, not just with the Muppet Vlog, where I would talk about a variety of different Muppet projects, especially all the episodes of The Muppet Show, but also that I have Animation Lookback, The Muppets, where you can also check out my documentary on both Jim Henson and the Muppets. And of course, once again, I want to thank all of you for watching this and for joining me on this little discussion about the documentary. So with all that said and done, I want to say, well, thank you all so much for watching again. And until next time, see you later, dudes.
I just have to thank him.